Jeong Yigon never wanted to inherit the Seongso Group, especially since his ambitious brother wanted the position more than anything else. To fall out of favor with his grandfather and put his brother's mind at ease, Yigon enters a fake relationship with Hanje Group's heir, Shin Tae-Kang. Their relationship started with Yigon having a short end of the stick, but will he be able to turn the tables? The series begins with two men talking inside an office while heavy rain is pouring outside. The one standing asks the other man if it is true that he doesn't desire to become the chairman. In response, the latter confirms that he is not interested in the position, nor does it fit him. After all, he prefers freedom. He then addresses the first man, Hanje Group, and urges him to believe his words. Unfortunately, it seems it cannot be done based on just words alone. Hanje Group pointed out that although the latter gave up most of his shares and is seen with different women every time, the fact that their grandfather still hadn't given up on him succeeding his position as chairman is also true. Hanje Group, who appears to be older brother of the other man, added that he will only believe his younger brother's words once their grandfather gives up on him. That said, Yigon's younger brother feels very threatened by his brother's sharp gaze and measured words. After all, he knows from experience the extent his brother will do to get rid of anything that gets in the way of his goals, even if that anything happens to be his brother. And this time around, Yigon is absolutely positive that if he fails to get on to their grandfather's bad side, then he will definitely die at his brother's hands. See, Yigon is someone that his grandfather cuddles, despite his womanizing and wild ways, even when his father had already given up on him. All because his grandfather believes that his business sense surpasses everyone in the family, although that may not be the case anymore if Yigon turns the other way. It's been 2 decades since same-sex marriage had been legalized all over the world, although that's not really the case for Korea's conservative conglomerate families. In fact, Yigon's grandfather is one of those who detest homosexuality, and Yigon will use this to protect himself. After being sponsored by a highly credible person, Yigon signed a non-disclosure agreement and became a VIP member of Caligo. While driving his car, he kept on thinking if he could actually do it with a guy, or perhaps he might just have to look for someone with a pretty face so he could top. Given the history of his relationships, of course, he's going to worry about these things. Although, personally, I think he's a Nico. Anyways, Yigon noticed the car that's been following him, which he knew for a fact was his brother's spy. He was kind of annoyed that by this time, it stopped being discreet about following him. That again, this was also to his advantage, since they could just directly inform his brother about his change in preferences. The thing is, Caligo is an exclusive members-only gay bar. Although Yigon had no idea how to flirt with guys to begin with, he basically went there without much of a plan. But his presence alone in the bar is already a big deal. Not only is he known as someone from the Seongso Group, but also because he's known for being a playboy, who's only into girls, not to mention good-looking. While the other members are indiscreetly gossiping and making bets about Yigon, another celebrity walks in looking pissed. His name is Shin Tae-Kang from the Hanje Group, which Yigon immediately recognized, although the fact that the former is gay seems to be news to him. And so, as Tae-Kang sat on the bar counter and ordered his drink for the night, looking like he was in a pinch, Yigon couldn't help but think that this was a God-given opportunity. You see, the Hanje Group is leading in the financial sector. Therefore, a scandal involving the Hanje heir will be so big and damaging that even his grandfather won't be able to cover it up, nor would he want to. And once his grandfather disowns him, Hanje Group will finally believe his words and eventually leave him alone. Everything worked out fine in Yigon's head, but the problem was getting Tae-Kang to agree. Then again, he's already come this far, so he should just go for it. Yigon stood up from his seat and approached Tae-Kang. The latter was just about to take his martini from the bartender when Yigon suddenly put his hand on the glass. Tae-Kang was annoyed at this as he looked up, although he was immediately surprised when he saw who it was. More so when Yigon's first words to him were for them to sleep together. Personally, I would have immediately said yes. Tae-Kang thought Yigon was just messing with him. After all, the latter is not known to be interested in men, but Yigon insists, saying he's tired of women. This shouldn't really concern Tae-Kang since all he's asking is that they sleep together for just one night. Tae-Kang immediately knew that Yigon was hiding something. Under normal circumstances, Tae-Kang would just brush Yigon off. Unfortunately, the former isn't exactly in the position to do so. See, earlier that day, Tae-Kang went to meet his grandfather, who was trying to convince him to get married. But Tae-Kang insists that he has no interest in women. Of course, Grandpa Hanje is very upset, especially since Tae-Kang needs to get married if he wants to be recognized as the heir. And that's why the older man already arranged a meeting between Tae-Kang and the granddaughter of Jeong Yigon Group's chairman. As Tae-Kang tries to reason with his grandfather, the older man points out that if his grandson does marry a man, the executives will use it to try to bring Tae-Kang down. After all, Tae-Kang's partner must be someone faultless, someone who can't be shamed in any way. Tae-Kang started being snarky, saying that he'd always been perfect anyway, so having a fault should do him good. But this sarcasm only made his grandfather more upset. Then again, the older man also knows how stubborn his grandson can be, and so they compromise, although with conditions. Grandpa Hanje tells Tae-Kang that if he must bring home a man to marry, he should be good-looking and from a family of equal footing, the Hanje Group. This is a problem, since the only conglomerate that can rival Hanje is Seongso, whose heirs are already infamous for being psychopaths and womanizers. Tae-Kang was so sure that his grandfather was messing with him, since there was no way he'd ever find someone who fit the older man's criteria. And yet here, Yigon is approaching him out of the blue and asking him to sleep together. Who was he to refuse? Not long after, the two of them went to a hotel. While Tae-Kang was taking a shower, Yihan paced the room anxiously. He had pulled the trigger, bringing him to where he was now. But then, so what? Yigon had no idea what to do next, sure. He had everything figured out about what was going to happen in the future. But what about the present? Also, his brother will not easily believe his new preferences in his partners, especially if all they did was sleep together once. So, of course, Yigon and Tae-Kang need to meet regularly for the jig to work. Suddenly, Tae-Kang calls out to Yigon, who looks taken aback. Looking up, Yigon sees the now freshly showered Tae-Kang standing before him and asks what he is thinking so deeply about. Instead of answering, Yigon responds by commenting about Tae-Kang's yummalicious abs. No, actually, that was just me. Anyways, Tae-Kang just chuckled before pushing Yigon down. Now that it's just the two of them in the room, Tae-Kang tells Yigon to tell him the real reason why he approached him, since Tae-Kang already knows that Yigon doesn't really want actually to do the nasty with him. In fact, Tae-Kang had already figured out that Yigon needed something, and only Tae-Kang could give it to him. Whatever it is, though, Tae-Kang is willing to participate, but only if Yigon wins him over. As for Yigon, his bells are already ringing in distrust, but since Tae-Kang himself said that he's willing to play with him, then Yigon should at least give it a shot, right? Moments later, Yigon finds himself having a face-off with Tae-Kang's enormous king cobra. Even though Yigon is obviously a man himself, he can't help but feel impressed at the size of the thing. In Tae-Kang's eyes, the latter is just making excuses, so he gives Yigon a hand by pulling his face closer to his snake. Owing to the size and this being Yigon's first time, it didn't take long for Tae-Kang to feel bored. The latter once again tried to assist the newbie, but this only resulted in Yigon's teeth biting the places they shouldn't. Pissed, Tae-Kang pushes Yigon off him, as he frankly tells Yigon that he sucks big time at doing it. And instead, Tae-Kang once again asks Yigon why he wants to do it in the first place. Testing the waters, Tae-Kang tells Yigon how he looks so terrified that he's just killing the mood. Realizing that Tae-Kang's loss of interest will definitely mean the end for him, Yigon grabs Tae-Kang's leg and begs him for another chance. Tae-Kang was surprised that Yigon would go as far as beg before him. At the same time, he's pleased to know that he has the upper hand in this relationship. Poor Yigon, however, is trembling as he promises Tae-Kang to do whatever it is that he wants this time. Not that he had any choice. Yigon needs to keep Tae-Kang interested in him, if he doesn't want to be done in by his brother. The Hanje heir, on the other hand, found Yigon's willingness to go so far amusing, especially since Yigon had no idea just how rough he could be. That may sound alarming, but Yigon believes it can't be worse than what his brother has waiting for him. Plus, before going to the hotel with Tae-Kang, Yigon had already thrown his pride away. So, this rough treatment should be expected. Tae-Kang didn't give Yigon any room to back down as he pushed him to the bed, ultimately granting him the second chance he had begged for earlier. Not long after, Yigon finds himself at the mercy of Tae-Kang as the latter prepares Yigon's black hole for his entry. Of course, since it's Yigon's first time, he's not exactly having the best time of his life, but it isn't a big deal in the face of a veteran Tae-Kang. In fact, as soon as Yigon involuntarily let out a moan, Tae-Kang knew he was just about ready. As Tae-Kang urged Yigon not to suppress his voice, he started to sheath his sword to Yigon's black hole. It was too much for Yigon, and he almost forgot to breathe if it weren't for Tae-Kang reminding and guiding him. But even then, Tae-Kang didn't stop pushing and pulling his pipe. The sensations Yigon felt was so foreign to him. He does feel pain, but at the same time, he also feels good. It was too much to handle, and before he knew it, he blacked out. The next morning, Yigon woke up alone in bed. His back hurts. No gout there. He's also feeling mortified for fainting the previous night. At least he didn't forget. Anyway, Yigon was contemplating what to do next, worried that his fainting halfway through the deed might affect his chances of securing Tae-Kang's cooperation. Meanwhile, in the living area of the hotel room, a fully dressed Tae-Kang looks back on his conversation with Yigon the night before. The latter had agreed to do whatever Tae-Kang wanted, as long as he granted Yigon one favor. Just as Tae-Kang was wondering about the reason behind his desperation, Yigon himself walked in. The latter wastes no time and tries to reach the point Tae-Kang welcomes. In fact, despite Yigon's blunder, Tae-Kang doesn't seem irritated at all. Instead, Tae-Kang tells him to explain the reason behind his desperation. Yigon didn't beat around the bush and immediately admitted that his brother was the reason for everything. Yigon then started explaining his situation, explaining that his brother didn't believe he was not interested in becoming chairman. If he can't prove it, then it's bye-bye for him. Yigon is so sure about the fact, but Tae-Kang mentally dismisses it as the former being delusional. After all, what kind of brother would kill his brother for succession, right? Well, apparently. Our ML isn't into ancient drama series. Moving on. Despite his doubts, Tae-Kang humored Yigon's claims. That said, the terrified younger brother added that he needs to get on his grandfather's bad side so he can stay alive. And for that to happen, he needs Tae-Kang to become his boyfriend. Ha Ki-young is getting a report about the events that happened with Yigon. However, since the reporter could only confirm until Yigon entered the gay bar and not afterwards, Ha Ki-young was not quite pleased. Ha Ki-young tells the man over to his side and suddenly pours the contents of the drink he has to him. "Oh, I have to censor my words, so you guys cursing for me. Yeah?" Anyways, it seems like the man with Ha Ki-young is actually Yigon's secretary, whom he planted to be his spy. And as it turns out, he didn't really do it willingly, but only because Ha Ki-young has something on him, or because he's afraid of the crazy man. Either way, Ha Ki-young has a tight hold on him. As Mr. Secretary made excuses about his incompetencies, Ha Ki-young received a message on his phone which reported the details the secretary couldn't provide. Call it a hunch, but Ha Ki-young knows his brother is up to something. And whatever it is, he also knows he can still use Mr. Secretary to figure it out. The next day, Ha Ki-young is on his treadmill when he receives a call from someone. My guess is the secretary reporting in detail about Yigon's whereabouts and how he's been with Tae-Kang all this time. Ha Ki-young then instructs to confirm if whatever the other two did is a one-time thing, or if there's something more to it. He also has to hold off the accident that they were cooking for now. Later that day, Ha Ki-young was on the balcony, reflecting on Yigon's most recent attempt to prove his disinterest in the chairman position. Ha Ki-young is quite impressed, although he feels like he still can't let his guard down, especially since Tae-Kang is now in the picture. After all, Tae-Kang is also fighting for succession, and getting involved with Yigon and his reputation won't really be an advantage to him. This leads to the conclusion that Yigon is planning something. If he weren't such a sick jerk, he'd be quite decent. We'll continue the conversation from the last chapter by returning to the S Hotel, where Yigon and Tae-Kang spent the night. Yigon explains to Tae-Kang that although he wants the latter to be his boyfriend, they don't really have to date. It's just a contractual romantic relationship they have to maintain, until Ha Ki-young finally leaves him alone. Yigon added that he is aware that Tae-Kang is looking for wife material, but he figured that since the latter is in the gay bar, he must not be straight. That said, Yigon promises to do anything Tae-Kang wants, as long as he can do one favor for him. Seeing the desperation in Yigon's eyes, Tae-Kang understood there was no use for negotiation. He has the advantage in this deal, and he'd like it to stay that way. Ha. So much for being someone with good business sense, Mr. Yigon. You don't even know the first thing to do when making deals. Anyways, Tae-Kang didn't waste time letting Yigon know what he wanted, and asked Yigon if anything included preparing his black hole for him. If they saw each other again, Yigon blushed. After all, it's a line that he had only ever said to others before. Still, he resigned himself to this fate and said yes. That was all Tae-Kang needed to hear, and just like that, the deal was on the table. Tae-Kang even promised to prepare a proper contract, which they can discuss later tonight at 6. Yigon thought that was the end of the conversation, but apparently, it was not. It seems that Tae-Kang has no plans to part ways with Yigon just yet. After all, the latter passed out the last night before Tae-Kang could finish, much to Yigon's dismay, who thought that Tae-Kang would let him off, seeing as he didn't say anything about it earlier. Tae-Kang instructs Yigon to remove his robe and get on the table before him. Yigon, of course, hesitated, but it's not like he had any choice. What's the point of keeping your pride when you're dead, yeah? And so, without saying anything, Yigon undid the belt and exposed his birth suit, love marks included, being subjected to this embarrassment, as Tae-Kang's boy toy is still better than the future that awaits him in his brother's hands. After getting on the table, Tae-Kang then tells Yigon to kneel and bend, so that his bums are up in the air. Yigon still hesitates, although he is quick to brush it off. Yigon did as he was told and at the same time wished that they were somewhere darker, so he wouldn't be so embarrassed. Suddenly, Tae-Kang pushes Yigon's head on the table, playfully scolding him for taking his time. With Tae-Kang now behind him, he tells Yigon to spread his legs more, so he can have a better view of his black hole. Doing so, Tae-Kang remembers what happened last night, when Yigon himself asked Tae-Kang why he suddenly stopped moving when they were in the middle of doing the nasty. The unbelievable part was that Yigon suddenly fainted after that. However, it wasn't all for naught, since Yigon's tear-stained face appealed to Tae-Kang. Anyways, Tae-Kang suddenly produced a hand lotion from his pocket and spread it all over Yigon's black hole. He noticed how it was swollen a bit, although nothing was torn. Yigon paused, suddenly feeling something against his bums, and feared that Tae-Kang would actually just start the rodeo just like that. Before Yigon could ask Tae-Kang to think it over, Tae-Kang had already started to move, not stopping, even when tears started falling from Yigon's eyes. Yigon almost cursed at Tae-Kang out loud, which the latter caught. But, of course, Yigon denied it, and instead explained that something was actually torn, and it hurt him. Still, Tae-Kang is hard at work, pointing out that this is what he meant when he told Yigon he'd be rough. He then tells Yigon that he just might change his mind if Yigon begs and says pretty please. Wow, is it just me, or is the ML the same species as the big brother? They're both hot. Yigon has been around a lot to know that whenever someone says they'll be nicer when they're already rough, it's only for show. Tae-Kang is quick to realize that this is something Yigon often does when he sleeps around. Then again, there's no harm in trying to see if it's really for show. And so, before Tae-Kang could tease him further, Yigon teased Tae-Kang with a smooch. After the latter finally unsheaths his sword, Yigon turns his body to give Tae-Kang a proper kiss. Apparently, his kisses are way better than his services, and Tae-Kang very much approves. Right after breaking their makeout session, Yigon acts flirty and spoiled, with a bit of insolence in the middle, as he rubs Tae-Kang's shoulder and tells him to be gentler, because he's already swollen. At the least, Yigon asks if they can move on the bed, since the table is hurting his knees. The way Tae-Kang sees it, Yigon is being more demanding than asking. Then again, he doesn't dislike it. And so, Tae-Kang asks if Yigon will be able to endure more of their rough play if he does do what he asks, not exactly letting Yigon take his time to give him an answer. Tae-Kang plays with his black hole, much to Yigon's discomfort. However, it did help since Yigon gave the answer that he wanted without much fuss. Soon after, they moved back to the bedroom, but instead of immediately getting into rough play, Tae-Kang took his time preparing Yigon, as he played with his nip-nops and serviced his sword. Yigon couldn't help but think that Tae-Kang was as messed up as his brother. Ha, that's what I said. Anyways, it's getting on Yigon's nerves that Tae-Kang seems always to stop teasing just before he reaches his limit. Tae-Kang then tells him that he should just hold it off since he's actually helping Yigon open up. And just when Yigon lets his guard down a bit, Tae-Kang suddenly sheathes his sword on Yigon's black hole without warning. Once again, he doesn't stop until he is satisfied. At least, this time, Yigon doesn't pass out. With all that out of their systems, Tae-Kang tells Yigon to clean up after himself, and that he'll just text him the location where they'll meet later and discuss the contract he'll prepare. All Yigon wanted to do was curse on Tae-Kang. Unfortunately, he can only do so in his head, I don't know about you guys, but this series is off to a great start in my book. And no, it's not just because there are a ton of hot yet malicious men to choose from. Moving on. Later that day, reaching his floor, Yigon wobbled as he was exiting the elevator. Good thing Mr. Secretary was there to assist him. Yigon brushes it off by saying that he went too far last night, to the point that his legs are too weak. Although the secretary's attention is focused on the love bite shyly peeping from Yigon's neck. Once settled on the couch in his office, Yigon said he was getting tired of playing with girls, and that he'd stop going to clubs as well. In response, Mr. Secretary asked if this meant that Yigon would start focusing on his work now. Instead of giving a proper answer, Yigon just good-naturedly pointed to the door, which the secretary took as a cue to be on his way. As soon as the other man left, Yigon stopped pretending to be okay. He is, in fact, still very much in pain from last night's and this morning's playtime with Tae-Kang. All he wanted to do was go home and rest, although that isn't really something he can do. Just as Yigon was asking himself if he could really keep on doing this with Tae-Kang, his phone suddenly went off, informing him that he had an incoming call. At first, Yigon thought it was Tae-Kang. Unfortunately, it was not. Yigon flinched when he realized that the incoming call was from his big brother and started fussing. After all, whenever his Hee-young wanted something from him, he would usually have his secretary reach out. As Yigon contemplated whether to answer the call, Ha Ki-young suddenly hung up. Now, Yigon becomes more anxious and regrets his indecisiveness. And so, this time, he dials and calls his brother's number instead. But the thing is, the call now goes to voicemail. Yikes. Later that evening, Yigon felt nauseous and distracted as he was being guided to the table that Tae-Kang had reserved for them. All because Ha Ki-young hadn't called him back, nor did he reply to his text message. Poor Yigon's thumb and nail had seen better days because of this anxiety he's been under since earlier. Anyways, Yigon was guided to a private room where he was told that dinner would be served as soon as Tae-Kang arrived. However, it seems like Yigon hadn't heard it. In fact, he was in a daze, thinking that he wouldn't be able to eat anything for dinner at this rate. Suddenly, he realized that the room he entered was empty, except for him. Yigon was kind of upset, given that there was still a minute left before the appointed time. He was fussing about Tae-Kang telling him not to be late when, by the looks of it, it was Tae-Kang who would be late. Yigon is even thinking of doing something if Tae-Kang does come even a minute past 6. Fortunately, or not, Tae-Kang arrived right on time and greeted Yigon with a kiss. He inquired what Yigon was thinking of doing, and joked that he should have come late so he could find out about it, which Yigon just brushed off. Not long after the two of them settled on their seats, food started being served, which apparently was all according to Tae-Kang's instructions. Christian Grey, is that you? Anyways, Yigon was expecting that this dinner would be all about discussing their contract, so he found it weird that they were actually eating dinner first and were even doing it in such a public place. Not to mention, Tae-Kang also came empty-handed. Well, the thing is, Tae-Kang deliberately didn't bring the contract with him. And this dinner is actually a proper date for the public to witness. In fact, it's already serving its intended purpose, since a lot of people who know and recognize them have already noticed them. Actually, Tae-Kang already planned that they'd just have the discussion later, when they go back to his place after dinner. Seeing as Yigon had no idea about it, he was about to call Tae-Kang out for it. However, he immediately dropped the idea, as he knew he couldn't win against Tae-Kang's reasoning behind his actions. Honestly speaking, he's actually more concerned about Ha Ki-young's call, which just doesn't come. Yigon is so anxious about his brother that he doesn't notice Tae-Kang already moving his chair right next to him. He also starts being gentle and flirty, pointing out how Yigon seems to be distracted. In fact, he even slices Yigon's steak for him, and feeds him a chunk of meat, as he promised to inform Yigon ahead of time if they'll be on a date. All of this he did as an apology. Yigon doesn't understand why Tae-Kang suddenly starts talking like that, especially since other people only see what they do and do not hear what they talk about. Then again, Yigon found Tae-Kang acting dashing, so it's not like he'll fault him for it. Later that evening, the two eventually moved to Tae-Kang's apartment. As soon as they did, they looked over the contract that Tae-Kang had prepared. Yigon sees it as in favor of Tae-Kang, although it was written in such a way that Yigon can't really refuse even if that was the case. Now, that's a businessman. Anyways, Tae-Kang tells Yigon that he has no intention of negotiating whether Yigon signs it or not. Despite his better judgment, especially with the ambiguous and broad wordings in the contract, Yigon eventually signed without a fuss, At least the contract was clear about Tae-Kang actively protecting Yigon from his brother. That said, as Yigon was signing the papers, Tae-Kang couldn't help but feel grateful to Ha Ki-young, since this deal gave Tae-Kang more time to deal with his own problems. After Yigon finished signing, he noticed Tae-Kang watching him intently and asked what that was about. Tae-Kang smoothly responded that it was just because he was wondering if Yigon had recovered from their session in the morning. Obviously, Yigon doesn't want to talk about it. But Tae-Kang, being the nosy one, or just genuinely concerned, insists on checking and applying the medicine himself. Now we find Yigon standing before Tae-Kang, who is seated on the couch. It seems like Tae-Kang had asked Yigon to lie down on his lap. Although Yigon doesn't really want to do this, the contract he just signed disagrees. And so, Yigon starts unbuckling his belt and soon is just left with his underwear, all the while thinking that Tae-Kang will do something nasty in the name of treating him. Not long after, Yigon resigned himself to Tae-Kang's whims and got into a planking position on his lap, embarrassing as it may be. As Tae-Kang slipped off Yigon's knickers, the former commented that Yigon's position would become uncomfortable for him, and that Yigon should just relax while on Tae-Kang's lap. Yigon, of course, knew that he was being silly and stubborn, so he just did as he was told. Whether he realized Yigon's situation or not didn't really matter. Tae-Kang just did as he said he would, applying medicine to Yigon's swollen and torn black hole, and even having him help by holding his own bum-bone cheek. As Tae-Kang applied the medicine, he couldn't help but comment that it was surprising that Yigon had only dated girls so far, since he was so sensitive, as if it was not his first time at all. Yigon was about to argue that it really was his first time when the medicine application advanced further in. For some reason, though, this made Yigon's sword start getting alert, much to his discomfort. After Tae-Kang announced that he'd done applying the medicine, Yigon thought that the next part would be doing the nasty, which he didn't want to go through for now. And so, even though Tae-Kang didn't say anything, Yigon went ahead and offered to service him, since Tae-Kang's sword was also alert. The offer made Tae-Kang laugh, since doing the nasty wasn't really one of his plans for the night. In fact, he was just about to suggest that Yigon get some rest. But since Yigon already offered, who was he to decline? It's safe to say that Yigon regretted opening his mouth. And so, Yigon started the service. But even after all the hints and guidance that Tae-Kang did, it seems like Yigon still has a long way to go before he does it properly. He was so bad at it that Tae-Kang pulled Yigon off his sword himself. But just as Yigon thought that Tae-Kang had finally let him off, Tae-Kang finished the job himself and let go of Yigon's face at the same time that the latter did. Tae-Kang didn't shy away from telling Yigon that he's bad at providing service, although his face does make up for this flaw. And with that, they're done, with Tae-Kang telling Yigon to stay for the night. Much later in the evening, Yigon is alone in the bedroom Tae-Kang prepared for him. Even after washing up, it seems like the fatigue he had accumulated throughout the day is still taking a toll on him. Yigon is exhausted physically, mentally, and emotionally. Tae-Kang is a mystery. He just can't figure out. One moment, he's being sweet, and then right after, he starts being mean. In fact, the room he's staying in now is Tae-Kang's and not an extra guest room. The latter is so confusing that Yigon couldn't help but think that perhaps Tae-Kang had some ulterior motive. Anyways, one thing he's sure of, though, is that he's sleepy, and thinking about Tae-Kang's behavior is just giving Yigon a headache. Not long after, Tae-Kang just got out of the bathroom and was just about to do some work, but then suddenly, he heard Yigon start moaning as if in pain. Without hesitating, Tae-Kang went straight to check on him. When Tae-Kang reached his bedroom, he saw Yigon on the floor and wondered if he was sick, since the latter was delirious. Upon checking, it didn't seem like Yigon had a fever, which ruled out the feverish delirium. This means that Yigon is actually having a nightmare. Indeed, it seems like Yigon is actually having a nightmare, a bad dream. In this dream, he was in the room that Ha Ki-young used to use back in their family home. The scene that changed his fate forever started playing out before him. Yigon was still in high school then, and Ha Ki-young confronted him, asking if he was interested in taking over the company. Yigon vividly remembers this memory, because it was the day when his relationship with his Hee-young started to sour. Back then, Yigon had done something he didn't mean to, but unfortunately, it cost his relationship with Ha Ki-young. If only Yigon hadn't made such a rash decision, then perhaps the two of them would still be on good terms now. Ever since then, Yigon has always blamed himself for what happened. Suddenly, The scene of the dream changed and Tae-Kang is in the corner glaring at him. Then, once again, it returns to a scene with his brother, where Ha Ki-young urges Yigon to prove his conviction. Otherwise, he won't be pleased with the consequences. With a start, Yigon sprung up on the bed. Finally awake, although panting and looking like he was about to cry, he suddenly heard someone beside him ask if he was fully awake now, much to Yigon's surprise. The said someone turned out to be Tae-Kang, who was reading a book until just seconds ago. Although he had promised Yigon that he'd sleep in a different room, he had no choice but to break it, since Yigon seemed to be having a nightmare. Yigon was touched when he heard this. After all, it was the first time that someone had cared enough to stay by his side when he was having nightmares, and weirdly enough, the gesture had made him less anxious than usual. After a while, Yigon laid back down, although he didn't look like he was going back to sleep. When Tae-Kang asks him about it, he explains that he doesn't think sleep will come to him soon. Tae-Kang then tells him that he should try sleeping, even if he doesn't want to, if he wants to match his schedule. At first, Yigon wonders why he would want to match Tae-Kang's schedule, but doesn't argue in the end, knowing that Tae-Kang would just be a smart ass about it. Anyways, it's already 1 at dawn, and Tae-Kang's day usually starts at 5. So, they really do need to sleep now. As expected, it was Tae-Kang who fell asleep first. As for Yigon, he usually can't sleep anymore when he has dreams about Ha Ki-young. This time, however, with Tae-Kang right beside him, is different. Not long after Tae-Kang was dead to the world, Yigon followed suit. A couple of hours later, Yigon slowly woke up from someone playing with his nip-nops. When he finally came to, he realized that it was just Tae-Kang teasing him. Yigon thought that Tae-Kang wanted to get some action this early in the morning. However, in Tae-Kang's defense, he just wanted to wake Yigon up. Well, the unorthodox alarm clock worked. After this, Tae-Kang tells Yigon to take a shower and put on the new suit he prepared for him. Is it just me, or did Yigon also get a nanny along with a guard? Tae-Kang is being unnecessarily sweet for just being Yigon's contract boyfriend. Not long after, the two of them, in a fully dressed and ready for work, eat breakfast together. Suddenly, Yigon asks Tae-Kang if he has been invited to a party recently. To be more specific, the party that Jeong Group hosts every 3 months. After all, it is widely known that Tae-Kang is close to that group. More than close, actually, since Grandpa Hanje had, in fact, planned to marry Tae-Kang to their granddaughter, which doesn't really matter now, since Tae-Kang now has Yigon. Anyways, truth be told, Yigon doesn't really like going to parties where he can socialize with influential individuals, since Ha Ki-young might get the wrong idea. But this time is different, especially if he goes with Tae-Kang. That said, Yigon didn't really have to ask Tae-Kang about taking him as his +1, as it looks like he's already ahead of him. After all, it's the perfect place to show off how taken Tae-Kang is with Yigon. Tae-Kang stood from the table and told Yigon that he already put a copy of the contract in his bag, and reminded him to pick up whenever Tae-Kang calls. I swear, this is turning into BL's version of 50 Shades of Grey. Agree? Yeah, I thought so. Moving on, Tae-Kang made a phone call after finishing breakfast. Everything just seems to be going Yigon's way, but for some reason, he still feels something is off. Well, a red flag is a red flag. Yigon was alone in his office reflecting on Tae-Kang's actions so far. In his book, Tae-Kang definitely acts strangely. After all, didn't their contracts say that it's Yigon's responsibility to fulfill all of Tae-Kang's desires? There was really no need for Tae-Kang to stay by his side when he was having night terrors or easily given to Yigon's whims, like taking him to that party when there was nothing for Tae-Kang to gain from it. Well, not exactly, but you don't need to know that yet. For now, Yigon just needs to see it as Tae-Kang being courteous. Meanwhile, Tae-Kang is in his car on his way somewhere and checking some information about Yigon. Tae-Kang's secretary explained that Yigon has the worst rumors any CEO could possibly have. Although Tae-Kang doesn't really seem to mind, he seems more curious about any mental issues that Yigon may have. Unfortunately, this is information that Ms. Secretary hadn't gotten her hands on yet due to the tight security on Yigon's medical records. But since it's something that her boss wants to know, she got no choice but to find a way, and discreetly as well. Back to Yigon's office, his musings were suddenly interrupted by his secretary informing him that Ha Ki-young had come to visit. When Yigon heard his brother's voice calling his name, he immediately sprung up to welcome him. After not responding to his texts, Ha Ki-young now visits his brother and even brings some fruits as a gift. Yigon didn't waste time and served his brother some tea and even started small talk. Ha Ki-young explained that since the two of them hadn't been in touch lately, due to their busy schedules, he decided to visit Yigon in person after his meeting ended earlier than expected. Although they also came to inform Yigon that their grandpa will be returning to the country soon and that they'll be having a family dinner that day, therefore Yigon should make sure to clear his schedule. That said, Ha Ki-young asked Yigon why he was not eating the apple that he bought just for him, the one in which Yigon is looking at uncomfortably. Before his Hee-young could say anything more, though, Yigon immediately took a piece and ate it, even making a show of how grateful he is for his older brother's gift. All he could think about was if he still had any allergy meds left. And as if already knowing about the allergy, the psycho even pushes more pieces for Yigon to eat. With a brother like this, it was no wonder Yigon felt so uncomfortable with Tae-Kang's generosity. After his brother had left, Yigon went straight to the bathroom to throw up all the apples he had eaten. Unfortunately, rashes were also already starting to show in his neck. Going back to his office, he took some allergy meds and slowly started feeling better, although Mr. Secretary tried to convince him to go see a doctor. Yigon didn't find the need to do that, however. Turns out, it's not the first time that this has happened, and all he needs now is to get a nap. Right after the secretary left, Yigon lay on the couch, slowly succumbing to sleep. His mind was filled with thoughts about his grandfather's return, and how this bullying from his brother would end by next week. He'd ensure his grandfather would return in a terrible mood by then. The day quickly went by, and soon, the sun was just about to set. Yigon heard his phone ring, and since he was half asleep and still recovering from his allergic reaction when he answered it, the immediate question of the caller was if Yigon was sick. Yigon recognized the voice of the caller and immediately sat up, assuring Tae-Kang that he wasn't sick, despite his husky voice. That said, Tae-Kang called to ask if Yigon had received the present that he had sent to his office. Although Yigon had no idea what he was talking about, Mr. Secretary came in to give him the bouquet of flowers delivered for Yigon. Now that's a present one should receive, not a freaking poison. Moving on. Once Yigon was left alone, he asked Tae-Kang why the sudden present, to which Tae-Kang responded that he just wanted to impress Yigon. Since Tae-Kang was being all flirty and nice, Yigon guessed that he was not alone. Anyways, Tae-Kang then asks what time Yigon gets off from work today, because the former wants to pick him up from work so they can go on a date. After handing the last documents to his secretary, Tae-Kang informs her that he'll be heading out since he's got dinner plans for tonight, and that she can just go home as well. After her curiosity finally got the best of her, Tae-Kang's secretary, Ms. Kim, asks her boss who he could go on a date with during this critical period. Tae-Kang immediately dropped Yigon's name, much to Ms. Kim's surprise. Despite already having the gist of what happened, she still needed to confirm it with her boss. How Tae-Kang just happened to know that Yigon also dates men, which immediately made Tae-Kang interested in him. And that's why he had her run a background check on Yigon. Seeing as Yigon is very much Tae-Kang's type, somehow, it's not that hard for Ms. Kim to believe this, which is exactly what Tae-Kang wants to happen. He wants to be as transparent as he can to her, since she's on his side. That said, it's not that Ms. Kim doesn't believe and trust her boss. It's just that all this time, Tae-Kang has been declining marriage proposals. And if he starts openly dating men now, even someone like Yigon, with all those rumors around him, well, it just spells disaster. In fact, she's positive that Chairman Shin, aka Grandpa Hanje, will lose it once he hears about this. Not that Tae-Kang is worried. After all, it was Grandpa Hanje who gave the qualifications for the Mannings allowed to date, which Yigon all possessed. So, there's no way that his grandpa will have problems with it. Later that evening, Yigon and Tae-Kang were just leaving the restaurant after they had just finished dinner. Yigon especially had a great time and liked the desserts they had. Since the night was still young, Tae-Kang invited Yigon for some drinks at his place, an invitation Yigon didn't hesitate to accept. Meanwhile, a bunch of people have already noticed the closeness between the two. Whether they're on the couple's side or not is yet to be known. One thing's for sure, though, that these people do believe what they see. Even later that evening, at Tae-Kang's apartment, Yigon is once again at the mercy of Tae-Kang. Despite feeling like he had been scammed into coming there to do the nasty after getting drunk, Yigon is also feeling it. In fact, Tae-Kang observed that Yigon is actually someone who lets his guard down once he gets drunk, to the point where Yigon would even attempt to hold on to Tae-Kang's sword whenever the latter tried to unsheathe from Yigon's black hole. The point is that Yigon is much more sensitive and honest when he's under the influence of alcohol, much to Tae-Kang's amusement. Yigon might have been straight until just a couple of days ago, but it turns out that he's a natural and a pro at receiving swords, and not just sheathing them. What's more amusing to Tae-Kang is that Yigon seemed to be enjoying himself and had totally succumbed to being a Nico. When Yigon tries to service himself to make himself feel better faster, Tae-Kang stops him. There's no need for that when Tae-Kang can just make him feel good with his sword on Yigon's black hole. Tae-Kang noticed that instead of the polo shirt he had prepared for Yigon in the morning, the latter had changed into a turtleneck, and even had a band-aid covering the nip-nop that Tae-Kang was teasing to wake Yigon up at daybreak. As Tae-Kang asked about it, Yigon helplessly explains that it hurts whenever it rubs against something. Although it wasn't Yigon's intention, his honesty seemed to drive Tae-Kang to want him more. Meanwhile, at Ha Ki-young's private quarters, a guard was by the door blocking the entrance, so that even Mr. Spy/Secretary couldn't enter when he came to give his report. After the guard explained that Ha Ki-young had instructed him to block the entrance, Mr. Secretary somehow knew what was up and decided just to wait instead. As for what was happening inside the room, it seemed like Ha Ki-young had just finished beating someone up so hard to the point that they said someone was bleeding all over. The disgusting part is that when Ha Ki-young instructed to pay him double as compensation, the willing victim even thanked him. Like, what the hell, dude? It seems like it's a common occurrence as well, since Ha Ki-young's personal secretary is so chill about it, too. Anyway, Mr. Spy is soon let in, and by the looks of things, his hunch that Ha Ki-young had just been using someone as a punching bag is spot on. At least he's not numb about it. Then again, that was the extent of his concern. Mr. Spy handed Ha Ki-young some documents detailing Tae-Kang's dating history. It seems that, just like Yigon, all of his past relationships have been casual flings merely to fulfill physical needs. However, with Yigon, it seems to be different. Not only do his past flings all look like Yigon, but Tae-Kang also invites him to his house and even lets him spend the night. Plus, there were also rumors that they had been spotted having a dinner date, not to mention Tae-Kang sending a bouquet to Yigon. Just from these alone, one would guess that perhaps Tae-Kang is, in fact, really smitten with Yigon. To Ha Ki-young, it seemed like an unbelievable turn of events. Although it all works to his advantage given that if Yigon does turn into a gay, then their grandfather will definitely cut him off for good. That way, Ha Ki-young will become Seongso Group's heir by default. Still, for some reason, it doesn't sit right with him. Should we tell him, guys? Heh. The following day, just 6 days before his grandfather returned to Korea, Yigon found himself alone. As he woke up in Tae-Kang's bed, Yigon's back hurts, his head throbs, and he just feels exhausted. He then remembers all those embarrassing words he spouted the night before as he gave in to his drunkenness. He cursed at himself, wishing that he had just blacked out instead. Suddenly, Tae-Kang appears and throws Yigon's phone to him as he tells him to take the call. It seems like Yigon's secretary is having an emergency. Knowing his secretary, the only time that he would call him like this was if it was about the executive board meeting. After checking the time, it seems like that is exactly the reason why he was calling. At 3 in the afternoon, Yigon is definitely already late. Still, he seems chill about it. Meanwhile, Yigon didn't even properly greet his secretary over the phone, when the latter immediately explained that he had already sent a car to Tae-Kang's apartment for him. Yigon asks how he knew that he was at Tae-Kang, obviously thinking that Mr. Secretary was keeping tabs on him, which he is actually, but that Mr. Secretary has the perfect excuse, explaining that he knew because Tae-Kang had answered his phone earlier. Yigon asks Tae-Kang about it, and the latter doesn't deny it. He says that it's because Mr. Secretary had called dozens of times already and thought that it was something really urgent. Yigon felt uncomfortable, although he didn't really make a fuss. Just accept it. This hot daddy is a big red flag, and that's it. Anyways, the urgency is, in fact, about the board meeting, but Yigon doesn't care. So he tells his secretary that he can't leave right away, since he just woke up. Instead, he instructs them to review the data while waiting for him. Mr. Secretary couldn't even appeal, as Yigon immediately ended the call. Back to Tae-Kang. Yigon caught him staring at him intently, making the latter uncomfortable. When asked about it, Tae-Kang teased that he had thought Yigon had always slept without a shirt on, so that Tae-Kang could enjoy the view. Yigon doesn't get the joke and tells Tae-Kang he's just comfortable sleeping like that. On a different note, he asks Tae-Kang if he doesn't have work. The selfish Mr. Red Flag responded that it was his day off. Yigon is, of course, upset, although once again, he keeps it to himself. As Yigon tries to stand up to take a shower, he suddenly stumbles on his feet and almost falls face first, if it weren't for Tae-Kang catching him just in time. Tae-Kang offers to help Yigon wash up since he's free, and seeing as Tae-Kang will just do whatever he wants, despite what he says, Yigon didn't refuse. And so, Tae-Kang carries Yigon in his arms, bridal style, slowly heading to the bathroom. On their way, Tae-Kang couldn't help but tease Yigon again, reminding him of what happened last night and how Yigon had been so accommodating and honest as they did the nasty, while Tae-Kang carried him in his arms. Yigon attempts to tell Tae-Kang off, but changes his mind soon after, and just asks the latter to talk about something else. This made Tae-Kang realize that even though Yigon was drunk last night, he still remembered everything that happened, since Yigon isn't denying it. Yigon didn't say anything in response and only internally wished that he had drank some more last night. That way, he would have totally blacked out and possibly not remembered anything now. Anyways, contrary to what Yigon had been expecting, instead of doing some more physical teasing, Tae-Kang just left Yigon alone to wash up, although Tae-Kang's inconsistencies somehow bothered him. Later that day, the executives of the Class Hotel were getting impatient while waiting for Yigon. Some of them tried to defend our MC, saying that Yigon was probably fooling around with one of his girlfriends. That's when another one informed them about the rumor that their CEO is switching to dating men now. Before it could be clarified, though, Yigon suddenly appeared, and after an insincere curt apology, the executive meeting began. For what it was worth, Yigon still made an effort to listen and check the proposal that was presented. He knew that even though it looked good on paper, the truth was that it was still a money laundering scheme. If it were him, he would reject it without a second thought, but since it has always been his aim not to draw attention to himself, giving his approval is the obvious course of action. After the meeting, Yigon heads straight to his office, where he complains about his aching back to his secretary. Mr. Secretary suggests getting a massage appointment, but as we know, that wouldn't really fix it. Yigon refused the suggestion and just asked about his schedule for the rest of the day. But before Mr. Secretary could answer, Yigon's phone suddenly went off. After seeing that it was an incoming call from Tae-Kang, Yigon sent his secretary away so they could talk privately. Although Tae-Kang's first inquiry is about the meeting, his real purpose for calling is about the party that they'll be attending together. The party is going to happen 5 days from now, and Tae-Kang has already arranged for the two of them to go together in Tae-Kang's car. The fact that the party is scheduled a day before his grandfather's return to Korea is perfect for Yigon's plans. Anyways, Tae-Kang suggested that it'd be in their best interest if they keep having dinner dates every day up till the party, a suggestion that Yigon did not refuse. For the next 4 days, Yigon and Tae-Kang went on dinner dates for everyone to see, and as expected, the rumors spread fast. Although there were ones who didn't believe them, there were also ones who guessed right, that it was done because of some hidden motive. Fast forward to the day of the party. As Yigon was finishing his work for the day, Mr. Secretary asked him if he was planning on attending the Jeong Group party tonight. When Yigon admitted that he was, Mr. Secretary immediately asked about the invitation that he hadn't secured. Of course, that's not really a problem, since Tae-Kang had already secured one for him. As expected, this piece of information is going straight to Mr. Spy's real boss. Later that evening, as he and Tae-Kang were on their way to the party, Yigon couldn't help but feel giddy, knowing that after tonight's party, everything would finally be clear to everyone. He would finally be free of his brother's suspicions, and their relationship as brothers would finally return to how it used to be. At the party, Yigon was alone, sipping on his wine after Tae-Kang left him to meet some people he had to greet. He reminded Yigon that they'd be apart for just a bit, so he should ensure he would not cause any trouble. After all, they wouldn't want to face some hitches at this point, would they? Tae-Kang also reminds Yigon not to act startled by whatever he says during the party and just to go along with it. He had been very suspicious upon saying that, which made Yigon wonder what the former could be planning. Suddenly, Yigon's musings were interrupted by a young lady, whom he had apparently not seen for a long time. The young lady's name is Baek Jui, and she seems to be close enough to Yigon at one point because she's wearing earrings that he had given to her before. My guess is that she's one of his former flings. Anyways, Jui denies Yigon's claims about the earrings. Not wanting to make a big deal, Yigon humored her claims and turned away to leave, but Juhi seemed to have other ideas. She starts talking about the rumors that she has been hearing about lately regarding him and Tae-Kang. More than the confirmation, however, it seems that Juhi is more excited about the two men sleeping together. She even guessed right that Yigon was on the receiving end. Before she could tell the whole world about this little conclusion of hers, Yigon had already stuffed her mouth with a macaron. That said, Yigon is not amused by Juhi coming up to him and suddenly spouting nonsense. Then again, you couldn't really blame her. After all, it seems like Yigon was the one who broke up with her over the phone when she said she wanted to try being a Tachi. Suddenly, Tae-Kang suddenly appears, seemingly looking for Yigon all this time, and even affectionately called Yigon Hyung. Going back to about 30 minutes ago, Tae-Kang had indeed been going around greeting others. Everything seems to be going well, until one intimidating woman suddenly approaches the group Tae-Kang is in and tells him she wants to talk. And Tae-Kang didn't think twice to follow. After going to the second floor, the lady called Tae-Kang out for not showing himself like he used to. Tae-Kang apologized, saying it was because he had been busy these days. However, the lady guessed that the reason was Seo-hae. In fact, the only reason he attended the party today was because Seo-hae was abroad. Well, Tae-Kang didn't deny it. Actually, the lady seems to know and respect Tae-Kang's preferences, and she seems to have a hand in breaking the talks about Tae-Kang's engagement with Seo-hae. It's not like it's a big matter to her, although she did wonder what Tae-Kang was actually planning as she glanced at where Yigon was. After all, even she's aware of the risks that may befall him after getting involved with Yigon. Of course, Tae-Kang knows about it well, but because Yigon had already become someone he needed, he was willing to do anything for him. Talking like that makes him really suspicious in her eyes, although it's not really her position to care. After Tae-Kang noticed Juhi approaching Yigon and started talking to him, the former suddenly became impatient and told the lady that talking like this was enough proof for others to think the two families were still on good terms despite the broken engagement. Since that really was the case, the lady let him go without a fuss. This brings us to the current situation. Tae-Kang had just approached Yigon, as if he had been looking for him for a long time. Yigon wondered why Tae-Kang suddenly called him Hyung, but owing to what Tae-Kang had told him earlier about going along with whatever he said, Yigon kept on a stoic face. Tae-Kang immediately recognized Juhi as one of Yigon's exes and the second daughter of the Baeklim times. He introduced himself to her. Although Juhi's attention was mostly caught by the men's closeness, when Tae-Kang asked her why she approached his partner, she couldn't help but apologize to him, seeing as what she had done had made him uncomfortable. Still, that didn't stop her from trying to get on their nerves more. She was amused by the fact that Tae-Kang would actually address Yigon as his partner at such a formal event, and decided to probe more. Juhi admits that she had doubted that the two of them were really dating, as per the rumors. After all, Yigon is free-spirited. Well, Yigon tried to scold her for that, but Tae-Kang seemed to have the perfect rebuttal. Tae-Kang accuses Juhi of insulting his partner when he's right in front of her, not to mention in front of such a huge audience. Juhi was somehow taken aback, not at all expecting that Tae-Kang would actually get mad. Although Yigon is fully aware that everything is just an act, it does feel nice, knowing that someone is on his side, someone who he can lean on. And so, as Tae-Kang continues to scold Juhi, Yigon tries to talk him out of it, saying how Juhi had always been like that, and that he just wants to be alone with Tae-Kang now. Of course, Tae-Kang didn't refuse and guided him to the lounge area, where he apologized to Yigon for making him wait. Juhi was convinced of the act because she was already thinking of publishing an exclusive news report about the two. Not long after, as soon as the two entered the lounge area, Tae-Kang pushed Yigon to the wall and scolded him about not staying out of trouble. In Yigon's defense, however, Juhi was the one who started it. Still, Tae-Kang was upset. Well, I say, he's just jealous that Yigon's ex approached him. Yigon clenched his fists, upset that this condescending and rude Tae-Kang was the usual, and most probably the real Tae-Kang. As if that wasn't enough, Tae-Kang now accuses Yigon of being in the mood after he saw one of his exes. Producing a toy from a small box, Tae-Kang is now the one trying to get Yigon in the mood. Tae-Kang tells Yigon how he'll now remind him of his role in their relationship. Yigon started feeling uncomfortable when he saw what Tae-Kang was holding. The latter muttered about how he was actually planning to use it in the car, but now seemed to be at best time for it. Anyways, Tae-Kang instructs Yigon to open his mouth, and without another word, feeds him the toy as he tells Yigon to make sure it's wet thoroughly, since he'll be putting it inside his black hole. Not long after, Yigon had no choice but to do what Tae-Kang instructed, but he seems to be doing it incorrectly, or at least in a way that's not to his partner's liking. Suddenly, Tae-Kang pushes Yigon to the floor and tells him to get on all fours with his bum-bums in the air. Tae-Kang then tells Yigon to hurry on, put the toy properly, and put his clothes back on within 5 minutes. That way, he might just take it out before they go home. Yigon does as he is told, taking solace in the fact that at least the toy won't hurt him like Tae-Kang's sword would. As Yigon kept on bidding his time, Tae-Kang pointed out that the former didn't seem to be worried at all that someone might see him in such a compromised situation. Then again, Yigon only did so, thinking that Tae-Kang had locked the door to the lounge earlier, but shortly he realized that might not be the case at all, and so he hurriedly got on his feet. But Tae-Kang suddenly stops him, perfectly aware of how shallowly Yigon had planted the toy, and instead does it for him. With 2 minutes left for Yigon to get himself decent again, it should have been doable, but for some reason, his pants suddenly didn't fit him anymore. By the time 5 minutes were up, Yigon found himself on the floor with weak knees, which was still very much not suitable for other people to see. As for Tae-Kang, the situation was very much to his liking. That was when they suddenly heard noises coming from outside the door, attempting to enter the room. The couple outside thought of leaving because it seemed someone was using the room, which was locked. But then suddenly, Tae-Kang opened it with Yigon right beside him, telling the couple that they could use the room now, since they were done using it. Tae-Kang assisted Yigon as they returned to the party. Because of the toy, all Yigon wanted to do was head home now. But then Tae-Kang insists they should at least greet the vice chairman before leaving. Since Yigon cannot keep a straight face given his situation, he insists that Tae-Kang go greet her by himself. Tae-Kang didn't want to do it at first, seeing as he didn't want to leave Yigon alone. But the latter insists and promises to stay in the restroom and not talk to anybody until Tae-Kang comes to get him. Yigon made such a compromise, thinking that he could at least lower the intensity of the toy's vibration. Tae-Kang was amused reading exactly what was on Yigon's head, but he did as Yigon asked and at the same time reminded him to keep his present inside. Yigon hurriedly entered one of the restroom stalls and started making plans to improve his situation for a bit. It shouldn't be that hard, right? After all, as long as he doesn't take out the toy, it should be fine. He trembled as he struggled to free his sword and take out the switch of the toy. To his surprise, the switch only has one button. Since it has an arrow that points down, Yigon thought that pressing it would lower the vibration. But as Yigon pressed the button, the vibration didn't slow down, and instead, it just got stronger. Yigon tried to improve his situation by playing with his sword, but it didn't seem to work. That is until he started playing with his black hole as well. He was just about done when someone suddenly entered the restroom and seemed to have locked the door. It was Tae-Kang, who had the toy's real control in his hands, and who had just switched it up, much to Yigon's discomfort. Tae-Kang then knocks on Yigon's stall and tells him to open the door. Realizing who was at the other side of the door, Yigon didn't hesitate to open it and pull Tae-Kang inside. Once inside, Tae-Kang tells Yigon how he knows that Yigon had attempted to change the intensity of the toy, which had obviously backfired. Yigon realizes that this is all according to Tae-Kang's schemes to push him to the end of his rope. Not seeing a way out of the situation, Yigon gives in and begs Tae-Kang to take him, much to the latter's surprise since he had expected Yigon to try and beg him to remove the toy. But instead, here he is desperately begging Tae-Kang for a hanky-panky in the restroom stall. Not that Yigon needed to do more. After all, he made Tae-Kang get into the mood, as much as he already was. Not long after, they started doing the waka waka right then and there, with the toy still very much active inside Yigon's black hole. Tae-Kang's dirty talks and teasing just don't seem to register with Yigon, who now realizes how much he feels about taking it in the back, compared to when he's just playing with his sword. Tae-Kang was about to produce tartar sauce, so he told Yigon to swallow it if he didn't want to walk around with some stains on his clothes. Yigon cursed at Tae-Kang in his head, but still did as he was told, although he did feel like puking as soon as he did. Still, Yigon managed to swallow most of it, if not all. That satisfied Tae-Kang, and with that, they decided to head back home to engage in some more spicy things.